most of us know that Joe Biden's presidency is already over. The question is, can it be resuscitated? Is there any hope for Biden being able to pass anything going forward? Well, we're going to bring on Max Burns to talk about that. He's a columnist at the Daily Beast, and he's also a Democratic strategist and the founder of Third Degree Strategies. It's a progressive communications firm. All right, so Max, a lot to talk about here. So first, given that they lost the vote on the filibuster, is there any realistic hope that they could pass anything outside of the standard budgets and defense bills, et cetera, for the next 3 years? And if there isn't, does that mean the Biden presidency is over?
Well, despite, I think, some of the optimistic messaging from Joe Biden that they're going to keep on fighting, with the filibuster in place, there's just no way. It's an impossibility. And that's specific to things like voting rights, to things that voters actually want. If it's raising the debt ceiling, yeah, Joe Manchin will carve out the filibuster in a heartbeat. But for other more important issues, unfortunately, I think this is it.
So actually talk about that for a second. Are they going to make some like nonsensical exception to raise the debt ceiling?
Yeah, I think the history of the filibuster is essentially the history of nonsensical exceptions. I mean, Democrats carved it out in 2013 for executive branch nominees. Republicans carved it out in 2017 to push Neil Gorsuch onto the Supreme Court. We carved it out just a couple months ago to address the debt ceiling, and both Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema completely supported that approach. Now it really is that the filibuster is whatever Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema want it to be. And unfortunately, that's not to help voters.
Yeah, well, that's such a great point, Max. I have to confess, I forgot about that. And so that means there's no logical nexus to their votes at all. There's no defining principle. And part of the reason I forgot about it is because mainstream media will never hold them to account. They never talk about the massive corporate donations they've taken, et cetera. But we've gone over that. So now let's focus on what can be done. So when you're talking about exceptions to the filibuster, there are a couple that have been mentioned that could make a difference for voting rights, for Build Back Better, and for actual bills that folks care about. So one is the democracy exception, and the other is a talking filibuster, which is not an exception. The talking filibuster is the filibuster. That's what it used to be, right?
Exactly.
And so, but first, before we get there, Max, they had a vote on ending the filibuster early on Wednesday, and they voted no, 52-48 with Manchin and Sinema crossing over. But what were they actually voting on? Was that killing the filibuster completely or no?
Yeah, so despite Republican fear-mongering about it, Chuck Schumer was never talking about killing the filibuster and going nuclear. This was a really specific exception to one specific bill, the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act. And what it said was that all Republicans had to do was honor the initial filibuster, speak until they can't speak anymore. And then when they're tuckered out and they can't push it any further, Chuck Schumer would bring the vote up at a bare majority, 51 votes to pass, and pass the legislation through. This was not going to affect anything beyond this bill. And yet still, Democrats, Manchin and Sinema, if they can be called that, marched lockstep with Mitch McConnell to make sure that little bit of reform didn't happen.
And how about the Freedom to Vote Act? If they'd gotten past the John Lewis Act, would they have also tried to lift a filibuster for that bill?
Yeah, what happened was Chuck Schumer and the Democratic caucus merged the Freedom to Vote and the John Lewis Act together into one single bill to maximize the attempted passage. And it effectively restored pieces cut out by the Voting Rights Act by the Supreme Court. It restored election integrity, it ended gerrymandering. And the hope was that by giving Joe Manchin effectively everything he wanted, a lot of this was in his own bill. Maybe they could bring him over, but the money was just too good to do good by democracy.
So they weren't trying to end the filibuster. They were trying to institute the old school filibuster, which is a talking filibuster, and we're basically using the democracy exception, and even that failed.
Yeah, exactly right. And the shocking thing is, if you look back, not that far in the past, a lot of senators would look at what Chuck Schumer was trying to do as completely unremarkable, as just the way the Senate worked. But now, even having to stand up and debate is beyond what Republicans and Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema want to do. And that's a really sad statement on where we are as a democracy.
So we're going to bring this back around to whether there's any hope. But before we get there, the details of this are really important. So the exceptions are plentiful, but nonetheless, they will pretend that an exception is unprecedented and crazy, right? But the talking filibuster, well, they can't pretend that that's crazy. That's exactly what the filibuster was for a long, long time. Max, I have to confess, I've also lost track of when it became a non-talking filibuster, because I'm old enough to remember when they used to have to talk. So when did they make that rule change and say, don't worry about it, you can just kill any bill you like and you don't have to talk endlessly?
So in 1975, the Senate essentially saw that nothing was getting done because you needed 3/4 of the Senate to get through a filibuster. So they lowered the vote to 60. And then over the next 20 years, there became this sort of tradition where merely threatening to hold a filibuster carried enough weight that you didn't actually have to stand up and do it. If the majority leader or the minority leader in this case said our party's going to filibuster, the majority would just take them at their word and not even bring the bill up to vote. Now that's to the point where you can't bring the bill up to vote now. So there is no real mechanism to have that talking filibuster. If anything, Chuck Schumer was trying to bring the Senate back to a more traditional place. And you would think Republicans would love that.
Yeah, well, of course, they don't care about principles at all. That is completely the fault of the mainstream media, because they've been pretending this whole time that these politicians have principles when it is counterfactual. It's absurd. Of course they don't have principles. Then why did they make all the other exceptions? And if the filibuster is so important, why did they change it so they don't have to talk? The whole point of the filibuster was that you were supposed to talk, and that you showed passion, like, oh no, I really, really don't want black people to have civil rights, and I'm going to keep talking about it until they don't, right? But now, if you don't have to talk about it, then you can just block anything you want. So, but I'm going to get back to the practical effects here. So, is it even in any rule? I know it's not in the Constitution. I know it's not in the law, but is it even in a Senate rule that they don't have to do a talking filibuster? Did that ever get codified? Or
nope.
Is Schumer and the rest of them just saying, well, I respect that non-existent tradition?
Yeah, this is another instance of the Senate having more faith in its camaraderie and its friendship with the other side than it does in actually enforcing its own rules. I mean, the cloture rule is clear. You have to hold a filibuster and then you have to take the vote. The fact that we are not doing that is an abdication of why these senators were sent to Washington.
So now here's another absurd, arcane procedural issue here that's becoming important. It looks like they have to filibuster, they have to break a filibuster before they even discuss an issue, but a filibuster doesn't even exist at that point, and then they have to break a filibuster at the end. What is that? Why is it at the beginning and the end?
Well, at this point now, we're just sort of making it up as we go, that now you can filibuster both the motion to proceed and the vote itself, which has never been the case. This is a completely invented rule that everyone has seemingly decided to go along with for the thought that they may someday need to use it themselves. And the end result is it just means nothing gets done and voters are left holding the bag.
Max, do you happen to know when they started saying that you could filibuster a motion to proceed?
I don't. That's very recent. I mean, that is largely a product of the Obama administration. They had a record number of Republican filibusters there that were really just threatened filibusters over procedural motions. And Harry Reid, to his credit, said, we're not playing this game, cut the filibuster for executive nominations and got some work done.
So but even in the case of motion to proceed, well, you'd still need cloture, and in order to get that, you could still theoretically make them talk, couldn't you?
You could, and you should. And even if under the current cloture rules, which are a filibuster and then you still need 60 votes, that's still preferable to make Republicans stand and defend why they're opposing this legislation. And that democracy exception is now showing to be more important than ever. A filibuster and a majority vote is the way that this was intended to operate, and it's the way that it should operate.
But wait a minute, so if you do a talking filibuster, the minute they stop talking, can't we pass it with 50 votes, or do you still need 60 votes? Then, because what would be the point of talking then?
The current rules are somewhat vague. They call for a 60-vote cloture, which can be altered by altering the Senate rules. It's not a constitutional rule. And that's what Chuck Schumer was trying to do. That's what's happened in the past. But the rules as written no longer reflect reality in any way. And that's the real sticking point for this.
This is insane. Okay, so now back to theoretical hope. Are there activists pushing for either a democracy exception or a talking filibuster? Have they picked one? Are they kind of pushing for both? Are they pushing in general against the filibuster? Like, is there a point, like a tip of the spear where people are leaning on it and going, okay, this we should insist that they do so that we have any hope of passing any of these bills?
Yeah, the push now is clearly to kill the filibuster entirely, to invoke the nuclear option. And to Chuck Schumer's credit, when he started this, he had only 20 Democrats willing to say they supported that. Now we're at 48. And if the people act and vote and push this forward, we can end the filibuster in the next term.
Yeah, there's no chance of that. The Democrats are going to get killed. They need it before the election. So, all right, I hear you. In other words, no hope. Okay, I think that my guess as to the way we should go, based on what you're saying, based on all the other reporting, is all the activists should unite on a talking filibuster and say that is the actual filibuster. If you're going to do it, do it. If you're not going to do it, then you don't actually believe in Senate tradition, and we prove unquestionably that you are all full of crap. And by the way, if the reporters don't call you full of crap, they're not real reporters. Because a filibuster is when you talk. It's not when you nod. That's the whole point of the filibuster. So stop lying. We should demand in mass that all of our politicians stop lying, both Republicans and Democrats.
That would be an admirable start.
It would be an admirable start, right? All right, Max Burns from the Daily Beast. Thank you, brother. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.